What is prejudice and realism in the errors of extrema?
The idea of prejudice. So essentially, we're doing two things in this overall metaphor, right? One of them is that we're defining the concept of prejudice in a very exact way, and that provides certain options. It allows us to see things that we wouldn't otherwise notice because of the precision of the definition. But the other thing that comes up is that this actually is not different than what is actually happening when people have prejudice. In effect, prejudice is a bit like somebody making a choice that something is a particular way or someone is a particular way, and then choosing to never take in any more information about that situation ever again. So, in other words, you know, if you were a person being discriminated against, it's like they made a judgment that you followed a stereotype, and no matter how much you acted it in any way other than the stereotype, they would just disregard all of it, right? And so in effect, there's a notion here that there is a complete absence of perception. There's a complete absence of any inflow of new data that would affect anything that was going on in the subjective. And so in effect, we're taking prejudice as being the perfection of that. So we're taking the concept, which is loosely defined in the sense of, a whole set of behaviors, and we're distilling it down into a specific behavior that is a kind of the meta behavior that holds together all of the other behaviors. And then we're saying, okay, what is actually going on? What is this meta behavior describing in a kind of fundamental sense? And so in this particular case, the circles which are open, which are white, are processes happening, and the circle which is blacked out is the process not happening. So in other words, there's no perception occurring. Whatever's going on in the subjective and whatever's that's creating as essentially expressions and whatever happens in the objective is completely unaffected by anything that might have happened in the sense of perception. And so in a sense, prejudice represents a kind of blindness, like a fundamental blindness, an insensitivity to the world taken to perfection. It's like a total absence of any sensory response to the world. And this would be a mistake. It would be, on one hand, a kind of situation that we would say, well, that just shouldn't happen in practice, right? If there's no actual flow, if there's no actual cycle, then in a sense there's a real incapacity that's created as a result. And so as a result, we tend to just sort of say philosophically, prejudice is a bad idea. Like it doesn't further, it doesn't create anything, it doesn't create outcomes. It's not responsive to the world in any real way. Now, obviously, I'm stating all the stuff that people already know, but in effect, it's the specificness of the clarity of this that comes out, right? Because then we look over on the right side, and prejudice is something that shows up in the social sphere, but we've now distilled it down to just about perception and expression between the subjective and the objective. But when we look at realism, we realize that realism is essentially very similar. Realism is to believe that perception is completely independent of expression, i.e., that there are things in the universe and I can perceive them or not, but they're going to be there regardless. And that there's absolutely nothing in the universe that is in any way contingent upon anything that would regard as subjective. The subjective is of no importance whatsoever. It's an epiphenomenon of the brain. And to the degree that it has an effect, it's part of the universe and not actually on this side of the plane of perception, i.e., from a realistic perspective or from a realist's perspective. All right. Now, somehow or another, I would hope that in pointing out that taken to the essence that realism cannot not be regarded in this same precise way, as the notion of prejudice cannot not be regarded in the precise way that it was done there, and that these two are effectively mirror images of one another. In fact, if the one on the left is a problem, then the one on the right has to be, because they're basically making the same mistake. They're cutting a thing off that's crossing the plane of perception. And so, in effect, the denial of prejudice can't be weaker than the denial of realism, or the denial of realism can't be weaker than the denial of prejudice. Because it's never the case that interaction is not. Interaction is. if you look at this particular thing, you can't hold the notion of realism as being any better than prejudice. You can't hold the notion of prejudice as being any better or worse than the notion of realism. And in effect, if you assume the notion of interaction is a flow and the flow goes both ways, which by symmetry it has to, then you find that you cannot not reject both the notion of realism and prejudice. That's why I call it an error. It's an error of extrema in the sense that we're taking an extreme position, but we're showing that those extreme positions are structurally and fundamentally isomorphic with the actual meaning of those terms in all situations. In other words, these are what are called closed-formed arguments. We take essentially a term that is relatively loosely defined, and we show that it is isomorphic with a strictly defined term. And then we show that the nature of that definition essentially creates conjunctions with other similarly defined structural terms. And therefore, we can make observations like, for example, that realism and prejudice are essentially distortions of fundamental process.